The legends of Norse myth have been passed down through generations in the form of two expansive sources of literature, the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda, collectively referred to as the Eddas. The Poetic Edda was a compilation of Old Norse poems recounting important details about Norse cosmology in addition to myths concerning the gods. Like Sony Santa Monica, we will be focusing on the Prose Edda, a book written by Snorri Sturluson that enshrines most of the information we know about the tales of the Norse world and its gods. This ancient manuscript was written almost 600 years after the Norse culture died out, when Christianity had long since displaced it as the dominant belief system. Snorri Sturluson himself was a Christian. He made use of poems from the Poetic Edda when writing his Prose Edda, but also added a substantial amount from different sources, including other poems that were lost to time. Since so much time was allowed to pass before such tales and myths were recorded, it is only natural that we are not even close to having the full picture, for there are many Norse stories that we do not have. For example, we know the names of many Norse goddesses and some of their attributes, but not their myths and rituals. This has provided an avenue to storytellers like the makers of God of War to impress their own signature when telling tales in this universe. Telling us that their stories were among the many lost to time certainly adds to the authenticity of what it is that they are trying to accomplish. Now, before we move any further, I wanted to give a big thanks to Neil Gaiman. His book on Norse mythology was very helpful when making this video. So join me as we piece together the lost pages about the adventure of a pale white ghost from a distant land with the pages collected in the Prose Edda. Kratos goes on a pilgrimage for an indeterminate length of time after his attempt to kill himself didn't work at the end of God of War 3. His sacrifice released the power of Pandora's box, but was not successful in freeing him from the nightmares of his past. He realizes that he is cursed to walk the earth forever, haunted by torturous visions of his life in Greece, believing that he should be isolated from everyone else as punishment. Given that he is a demigod that has started to look quite a bit older, I am going to assume that hundreds of years pass before he eventually finds himself in the Norse lands. This opens the door for other stories that chronicle his adventures to other places before reaching Scandinavia. These stories could be explored in other mediums too, like comic books or even a Netflix TV show. Christopher Judge could easily play a live-action Kratos if they decided to do a TV show. I have noticed that the Stonemason edition features the first issue of a digital comic from Dark Horse Comics, and Corey wrote on the PlayStation blog that it will start to unearth the story of Kratos before his quest with Atreus begins. From what I can gather, PS4's God of War will start a bit later on in the timeline when Kratos has already started his adventure with Atreus. I guess this makes more sense in the context of introducing the story to newcomers and fans alike. It also paves the way for the game to carry the long series tradition of opening with a giant action set piece. We will probably get bits and pieces of backstory along the way in the order that they happened, which takes us back to Kratos wandering the earth for hundreds of years before reaching the Norse world. The prologue of the Lost Pages, drawn in sand art by Joe Castillo, gives us an idea of what happens when he arrives. After we see that the pages were ripped out of the Prose Edda by an unseen hand, an image is drawn of a forest that resembles the very one that we saw from the gameplay demo of E3 2016. Atreus' mother appears, wearing a cloak of some sort, and Kratos follows, who is drawn with a fully fledged beard, telling us of the long, arduous journey that he took beforehand. The prevailing theory right now is that she is Hathor, the Egyptian goddess of love, joy, and fertility. A few people, myself included, find the placement of her statue in the E3 2017 trailer to be a bit suspect because it might be directly hinting at this. Barring an actual journey into other foreign lands, nothing else highlights the presence of other mythologies coexisting more than this would. She also sounds like a great match for Kratos on paper. Hathor was a goddess of death and destruction at one point in the form of Sekhmet. She was used as an instrument by Ra to punish the human race after they plotted against him, and Hathor almost wiped them out before he had to intervene. It's possible that this is what she is running away from, and it establishes some common ground between Hathor and Kratos to connect over. Prior to deciding which mythology to go with, Sony Santa Monica were reportedly split between Norse and Egyptian mythology, so making the mother an Egyptian goddess would be a nice compromise. One could even argue that something like this was hinted at when Corey told Game Informer recently that while God of War will be focusing on the Norse setting, it will also showcase a high concept that shows different mythologies existing simultaneously. In the God of War universe, creation stories from each mythology explain how different cultures sprouted in certain geographical locations, like Egypt and Scandinavia for example. They both seem to be holding the Leviathan axe, and we know that it's this weapon because it was described as having a long history with Atreus' mother and her family lineage. The origins of the axe will be dissected in further detail later on, but we don't quite know how it gets to her from Brock and Sindri. Another theory is that she is a Vanir goddess, which would bridge that gap for us. The axe was born out of the guilt that the craftsman felt from the havoc that Thor was wreaking with Mjolnir. Thor was said to be happy when the giant Tharmor fell on a village that worshipped the Vanir god Freyr, so the Aesir must still have been at war with them. If they wanted to restore balance, someone from the Vanir pantheon would certainly be a good candidate for the axe. It could have been Sjöfn's family, the Vanir goddess of love. Freyr has been suggested, but I think that she is too significant to play a role in Kratos' new family. There is a chance, no matter how remote, that she is just a normal human, but I think this is extremely unlikely because of how much they are building up the subject matter of who she is. Having Atreus' mother be a nobody wouldn't explain why she wears a hood like she is trying to hide something. For the record, I'm not against this sort of thing, I'm merely against the idea of building up what are really minor details that should have been addressed near the beginning. After Atreus is born, we see a drawing that morphs into Kratos carrying something with a dagger in his hand. This is probably the same one that he tells Atreus to pick up later on, and seems to feature prominently throughout their journey. We know Kratos wasn't around for most of his son's childhood, and it's because he used to go out on mysterious day-long hunts. While Kratos is away, Atreus' mother teaches him ancient Norse and how to read and write the Elder Futhark runic alphabet. Runes were a written expression of the language in the pre-migration era of Scandinavia. It was very important to know them because they gave you power, and this was why Odin went 9 nights without food and drink while hanging himself from the world tree Yggdrasil to discover them. Most magic involves spoken incantations, so Atreus will be the one using it in combat. Kratos will apparently be staying away from magic in this game because it reminds him too much of his encounters with the Greek gods and the Titans. The player will still get to mess around with magic when using the dedicated sun button, but it will be a no-go for Kratos. Pressing square, the dedicated sun button will also get Atreus to translate runes for you so you can figure out how to solve puzzles. He can read in many of the languages used in other realms as well as the local one of Elder Futhark. In fact, translating the language of a different realm and then translating it back to the base language of Elder Futhark was said to open up new sections of the game outside the critical path, including quest lines. To some, this might disprove the theory that his mother is Hathor, but we mustn't forget that she was patroness of foreign lands, so it was part of her job to be knowledgeable about other cultures. It appears that it was in fact Atreus' mother that tattooed runes on his body, and it is a form of magic that imbues you with the power to enhance certain characteristics, like the ability to be more accurate when shooting an arrow, having a clearer head and more. This is why the runes on his arm spell out strong arm, luck with arrow and quick hand. Corey also hinted that tattooing runes could hide you from the gods themselves. It therefore does not surprise me that Game Informer got the impression while visiting that Kratos was trying to hide his family from the gods and keep a very low profile. This brings me on to the next segment, which very clearly shows the death of his mother as the artist blots out her picture and replaces her with a body that is being cremated on a pile of logs. It is no coincidence that the main theme starts to play just as this happens, which to me represents the looming threat on the horizon from the Aesir gods, particularly from Odin, Thor and Loki. Kratos finally gets home from a day of hunting, but is too late when he arrives, and the adventure starts shortly afterwards in the same setting as the gameplay demo from E3 2016. This was later shown more concretely in the recent story trailer, where Atreus recites Norse funeral rites for her. The fact that she dies at an early point in the story tells me that it's not Freya, because she was a big player in the Norse myths and legends. It was customary in Norse times to cremate the dead, and Atreus talks of her request to scatter her ashes from the highest peak in the realms, almost as though she wanted them to travel as far as possible. Before she is cremated, Kratos also tells her to find her way home, further compounding the idea that she is not native to Midgard and comes from a foreign land. I think the prominent brown bag that we see contains her ashes, and there are 3 clues in particular that point towards this being the case. The first is the somber expression on Kratos' face when he opens it up and looks at what's inside. The second is that the artist draws sand from a replica of this very bag while drawing the art for us to interpret. Cremated remains actually resemble coarse sand more than ash, so if you wanted to make it grim, you could imagine that he used the remains of Atreus' mother after the bag was dug up from Scandinavia. The third and most obvious but significant clue is the fact that the subtitle for the prologue is a saga born of ash. This is when parallels can start to be drawn between Kratos and his son, as Kratos' original journey in ancient Greece was also born of ash on the night he became the ghost of Sparta. It appears that the death of Atreus' mother forms the impetus for their journey into the Norse realms, and her ashes are attached to the duo in the form of this brown bag. It was confirmed by the combat designers that God of War will in fact play around with the idea of Atreus turning out to be just like his father. This was recently brought to the forefront in the story trailer when we see a bit of Kratos' rage inside him. But what if there was a deeper, more mysterious force at work that gave the gods a more harrowing reason to hunt Kratos and his family down? The first chapter of the Lost Pages chronicles Odin's manipulation of a gifted seer named Groa, so that she could see further and longer than anyone else could. It wasn't explicitly said, but I think Groa must have been a practitioner of Seder magic if she was someone that had substantial prophetic talents. Odin commissioned Thor to kill her husband Ervando during their journey to Vanaheim, but hid this from her using enchantments. Because this magic could be used to discover hidden details in physical locations, in addition to seeing into the future, Odin knew that in her pursuit to find her husband, she would be able to see far enough in time to glimpse events that were even beyond his reach. While he had visions that Loki's children would become the greatest foes of the gods, I don't think he knew about Ragnarok until Groa grew powerful enough to see images from this seminal event, also known as the Twilight of the Gods. It was the end of all things when the world would be destroyed with fire and the Norse gods die in the ultimate battle against the Jotuns and fire giants, as well as Loki and his children. We discover through this prophecy that the fates of Kratos and Atreus are entwined with the events that build up to Ragnarok. This revelation sent chills down my spine because it falls perfectly in line with what we have analysed on this channel so far. Groa realises that she got played after not being able to discern the location of her husband despite being able to see far enough until the end of the world. Odin visits her after feeling the ripples of this prophecy across the realms and mercilessly kills her, taking all of her knowledge with him, which would certainly put a target on Kratos' back and his sons. Now Kratos obviously knows about this somehow to tell Atreus that he's cursed, and this is what leads me to believe that he has already encountered the gods in some capacity before the events of the game take place. Much like his father Kratos, Atreus will somehow be instrumental in the end of another belief system. It is no doubt a more threatening way for Kratos' past to come back and haunt him, as the Norns would have no choice but to pass on this unresolved karmic cycle while weaving Atreus' destiny. We already had a few signs that this game will be a continuation of one of the main themes of God of War 2, that of the sins of the father, not least of which was the choice of a name like Atreus. The Atreus that we know from Greek mythology was also cursed to carry on the violence that his grandfather started when he murdered his son and cooked him for the gods to eat. Atreus repeated these actions by killing his nephews and cooking them for his own brother to eat, which sets a bleaker tone in possibly foreshadowing that Kratos cannot break the cycle and that Atreus will continue what Zeus started. While he sees the same weaknesses in his son, Atreus is also a reminder that this problem can be fixed with a different solution than the one he thought of in Greece. While we have received multiple affirmations that this won't be a tale about revenge, I think it has to be addressed through Atreus if it's going to be about Kratos teaching him to go on a different path. He may very well be seeking revenge for the death of his mother in the same way Kratos was when he set out to kill Ares after the death of his wife and child. It won't be at the forefront, but you can also hear Kratos telling Atreus that there are consequences to killing a god, and it may be because Atreus wants revenge on the Aesir for the death of his mother. What makes this quest even more personal for Kratos is that he already lost 2 family members to this curse back in the Greek era. They were of course his mother Callisto and his brother Deimos. Ghost of Sparta chronicled the story of Kratos' failure to protect his brother in particular when it was prophesied that a marked one would bring about the end of Mount Olympus. In the 30 years that he was kept prisoner by the gods, Deimos spent much of that time blaming Kratos for not being able to save him. I would not be surprised if he gets visions of this as an expression of his anxiety over whether he is able to protect Atreus. We mustn't forget that Corey wrote Ghost of Sparta, and he confirmed that voice actors from previous games will be reprising their roles, further adding fuel to this fire. I expect the event of Atreus' mother dying to harken back to young Kratos trying to stop Deimos from getting kidnapped, with Atreus getting scars in the process. So how is Kratos going to fix this? I think the death of his partner prompts him to tackle this curse head on instead of trying to hide from it, and this is when the witch in the woods tells him that he needs to go to another realm to find what he is seeking. This takes him across Midgard, high up in the mountains where we see a tree that represents Yggdrasil and what looks to be a doorway to other realms. We get a closer look at this area in the story trailer, where it transpires that Mimir can be found there, grown into the tree like the three-eyed raven from Game of Thrones. Mimir uses his eye to open the portal for them, and Kratos has a contraption in lieu of his head later on that might help him with traversing the world tree when Mimir can't be around. If you look closer at the glowing image, you can very clearly see Yggdrasil, which could give the player the option to travel to other realms they've been to so far. The Norse gods used the Bifrost Rainbow Bridge to travel between the 9 realms, but it was guarded by Heimdall and would burn the feet of anyone that tried to use it outside of the Aesir gods. So right now the best idea that we have of what Kratos might be after is the most powerful form of Seder magic that allows one to alter the course of someone's destiny and lift a curse. This might be through someone or something, like a tome of some kind that is similar to the ones Grower used to collect. Either way, we know the MacGuffin is located in a different realm, and judging from the beings that we see near the end of the story trailer, it'll be Alfheim. For reasons that will be explained later, Alfheim has a connection to the Vanir, and those auspicious beings that we see could very well be Vanir minor Norns that have a connection to the magic that is key to achieving Kratos' end goal. It's important to note that not even the gods could do this though, and I think only the 3 main Norns were powerful enough, but their word was pretty much final when they decided on a child's fate. However, unlike Greek mythology, we are now dealing with a more dynamic model of fate, where your destiny is not final and unalterable. The Norns only decided the earliest form of who you're going to be, and all beings have some degree of control in shaping their own destiny and the destinies of others. Kratos might be looking at Seder because it was the most direct form of doing so and would somehow be easier against the struggle that he is facing in connecting with his son. It's possible to do it passively through your own actions if they are strong enough, but Kratos isn't even close to that position yet. Though the name Atreus takes us to one place, he may not be completely doomed to follow in the footsteps of his fathers. Another question to discuss is just how much background Atreus actually has on his dark lineage. He tells his father that he knows the truth, but judging from the way Kratos says it's back, he doesn't have the full picture. We get to see an extended version behind the scenes through motion capture, and it looks like Kratos gives him some more information on what's happened in Greece, but I don't think he tells him everything. When asked whether Atreus knows why Kratos' skin is ash white, Corey said no, indicating that he is yet to find out about the night that Calliope was murdered. It might be left to Loki to reveal, or for Atreus to uncover while reading Kratos' mind during a nightmare. Some might say, well, this motif is all well and good for a fictional story steeped in mythology, but it doesn't actually have any application to real life for what is supposed to be a more grounded story. However, the repetition of issues across a lineage is in fact a phenomenon that has been identified in real family trees. If you don't believe me, look up the term psychogenealogy. According to famous psychoanalyst Carl Jung, we share connections with our ancestors in our subconscious mind called invisible loyalties, which can manifest in positive qualities but also negative ones like anger, sadness, and relationship problems. Psychogenealogy is pitched as a therapy that allows one to discover such invisible loyalties to break through any blocks and challenges stemming from the family tree.
For example, if there is some kind of betrayal from generation to generation, it actually proves us that clearly there's something going on in our family. And then we lock ourselves in that scenario.
Yeah, that's exactly this. We can tend to repeat things that has been going on in the past, that our parents and grandparents have been living, and without knowing it at all. And this is what we are going to study with a client coming to us, and we'll be trying to free him from these repetitions of the past that can be going on forever if you're not conscious of what's going on. So this is what we do.
There will be many factions and relationships to uncover, in addition to character reveals as we explore the Norse lands in God of War. When it came to composing the soundtrack, Bear McCreary spoke of the emphasis on writing musical scores for different characters and arcs instead of the realms. Each character is said to have their own theme, but there will still be ones that pertain to a certain realm narratively that won't only be used when you're there, i.e. when someone refers to it early on in the story. The relationships Kratos has with certain characters will evolve, which brings me on to what he has going on with the world serpent, otherwise known as Jormungandr. The duo were probably instructed to throw the Leviathan axe in the farthest corners of the world's sea if they wanted help on their quest. Like us, Kratos will make assumptions based on his experiences with Greek mythology. Until Atreus told him that the world serpents wanted to help them, he was ready to fight it. Corey spoke of his influences from Neverending Story in subverting expectations by introducing big monsters that look bad but could very well be your friend. In order to understand why he is willing to help Kratos, it is important to know his backstory. He was the product of an affair that Loki had with giantess Angerbotha in Jotunheim. When Angerbotha gave birth to 3 children, Odin had a vision that they would be the greatest foes of the gods in a time that is to come. He instructed Tyr, the Norse god of war, and Thor, the Norse god of thunder, to journey into Jotunheim and bring all 3 children to Asgard. They were seized away from their mother and tied up. Jormungandr in particular was the size of a normal python back then, but was growing at an alarming rate and could spit burning black venom. When they were brought before Odin, he took Jormungandr to the shore of the sea that went around Midgard and threw him into the water, where he would grow until he could wrap his entire body around the realm. The girl was described as gloomy and disturbing, looking half alive and half dead. Her name was Hel, and he made her the ruler of the deepest and darkest of places, Helheim. Those that die in unworthy ways go to Helheim in the afterlife. Examples were of sickness, old age, or accidents. The last child, a wolf by the name of Fenrir, could speak in the language of men, and like Jormungandr, it too was growing fast, and so was its strength. Fenrir actually grew up in Asgard under the watchful eye of Tyr until Odin became threatened by how big he got. He was tied up in an unknown location using a rope called Gleipnir that was crafted by dwarves. We know that he is definitely out there somewhere in God of War because Groa's vision saw what was described as an enormous beastly wolf rampaging across the countryside and consuming the sun. The myth is at its most interesting when Fenrir turns to Odin and tells him that had the gods kept him free, he would have been a friend to them. He promised Odin that he would kill him one day after eating the sun and moon. This is fascinating to me because it plays into the idea of the self-fulfilling prophecy, that in trying to prevent the events of a prophecy from happening, your actions end up influencing reactions that fulfill it. The story between Kronos and Zeus is often cited as an example of this, and it has become a fairly common trope in storytelling. Putting Kratos in the middle of all this should make for some pretty compelling material because of the way people's actions will reflect back on him as a reminder of the same mistakes that Zeus and Kronos made, and by extension himself. Odin was supposed to be the god of wisdom and knowledge, but might not appear as such when Kratos is in the room because of his experiences. I'm sure that this will also play into Kratos' psychology in his efforts to lift his son's curse. What if the journey they go on to do this ends up being the reason why his son goes bad? The Atreus from Greek mythology didn't even break his family curse after all, it was his grandson Orestes, suggesting that these repetitions will carry on for at least a few more generations. Kratos will run into people seeking vengeance throughout his journey, and I can bet that the world serpent is among them because of how the gods treated him and his siblings. What better way to exact revenge than to get the help of a god that actually succeeded in doing so when he went through the same thing? But I think this will be the cause of their paths to diverge because I can imagine Kratos advising against this, knowing where it will lead.
It's interesting to kind of flip the norm on Kratos. Like, Kratos is not seeking vengeance, but seems to run across a lot of people who are experiencing the world. When he's on this different path, a lot of the world starts to reflect back to him choices he's made.
In the moments before we get a proper look at Jormungandr, we see a statue of Thor which all but confirms his existence in this universe. We don't know the specifics of what he will look like yet, but we can discern a cape, a hammer and a helmet. Thor was actually a redhead in Norse mythology, not blonde, and he was the strongest of the Norse gods. He was known for having three main possessions: the power belt Megangyrf, a hammer named Mjolnir, and iron gloves he uses to wield Mjolnir. Megangyrf means power belt in Old Norse and was said to double Thor's strength when worn. It could potentially be an item that he makes use of in the second phase of a boss battle, for example. The golden braces that we see on the statue could help absorb some of the lightning that he conducts in order to avoid being completely fried while using Mjolnir. Trolls and frost giants would all tremble at the sight of this hammer because of how many of their brothers and friends it killed. No one killed more frost giants than Thor, and he had the title among the Aesir of being the defender of both Asgard and Midgard. He goes on regular patrols in Midgard to look out for any Vanir gods or giants to kill. He also travelled on a chariot pulled by two huge goats that could fly, called Snarler and Grinder. You might be wondering what a statue of Thor is doing on the edges of the World Sea, but it must have been built in homage to the World Serpent's first real encounter with Thor. So the story goes that the Thunder God wanted to borrow Hymir's cauldron for brewing beer, so Thor agreed to help him fish in the waters of Midgard. When Thor threw an ox into the sea as bait, the World Serpent responded by biting on the head, and the hook seethed very deep into its mouth. Thor held onto the line despite Jormungandr spitting black gouts of poison and the risk that it would sink the boat. He pulled the World Serpent's head closer and closer so that he could strike it with Mjolnir, but Hymir's bait knife cut the line before he could make the finishing blow because he was worried about drowning in the process. Jormungandr went back into the sea, and this would pave the way for their bitter rivalry. A few elements have been stripped from God of War in the spirit of moving forward, but the grand sense of scale will clearly not be one of them. There is a moment in Midgard when Kratos stands before the dead body of a frost giant, otherwise known as a Jotun. Even if you go back and look at some of the original concept art that inspired this new direction, you will notice a frost giant in the background, illustrating that they wanted to retain the same sense of scale that was achieved with previous God of War games. What we see before us is probably the size of an average adult Jotun, and this would be congruent with the descriptions that we have in Norse mythology. In the tale of Thor's journey to the land of the giants, he was described as a beetle by comparison. When he visited Hymir's abode, there was a giantess in the kitchen cutting onions the size of boulders and cabbages the size of boats. Her voice was described as sounding like a crowd of people shouting, and the thimbles that she carried were the size of buckets that could be filled with beer. The frost giants were basically very big if you didn't catch my drift. The giants are the masons of this universe that created remarkable structures, and the third chapter of the Lost Pages reveals that the dead body before us is none other than Tharmor, the greatest builder that the Norse realms had ever known. Tharmor left Jotunheim while building its walls to find his son in Midgard after getting into an argument with him. Thor heard his cries and struck him with Mjolnir, which led to Tharmor falling on his chisel. It was left as a reminder to the Jotuns of Thor's might, and they all retreated to Jotunheim as a result. This means that we won't come across any giants while in Midgard. The good news is that Jotunheim might be the first of the outside realms that we get to visit. The corpse of Tharmor was said to face the mountains of Jotunheim, and the portal that Mimir opens looks like it goes to this realm. The giants left behind a temple in honour of Tharmor that was not completed, and it was the stonemason's fall that would shroud the surrounding land in frost and ice for miles on end. If you look to the distance at the end of the E3 2016 demo, you can see Tharmor's hammer from afar, giving us an idea of the direction that Kratos and Atreus are headed in. The Aesir gods had been wanting to invade Jotunheim for years, and Thor in particular was known for torturing the Jotuns to find out exactly where their kingdom was located. You might be wondering why there was so much animosity between these two races, and in order to understand that, one has to go all the way back to the creation story of the Norse universe. When fire and ice met from primordial realms known as Muspelheim and Niflheim, life appeared in the form of a giant called Ymir and a hornless cow Audumla. Ymir was bigger than any of the giants that descended from him. Audumla licked people from blocks of ice, and among them was Bori, the ancestor of the gods. Odin and his brothers were born to a marriage between Bori and one of the giants that Ymir gave birth to. The three brothers were caught in the void of the Ganuga Gap between the deadly fires of Muspelheim and the darkness of Niflheim's mist, but it was ready to be filled with life, so they killed Ymir using different parts of his body to make the worlds. The blood that gushed from Ymir was so deep it drowned all of the giants apart from Ymir's grandson and his wife, who understandably weren't happy with this. It was the spark that lit the fires of their conflict, resulting in walls being built around each of their respective kingdoms to protect themselves from the other faction. Going back to the shot of Tharmor, we can see Kratos carrying a severed head on his back, which is none other than Mimir. It can also be spotted in the scene when Kratos meets Sindri for the very first time, so it's fair to say that Mimir will be there from earlier sections of the game. Mimir previously lived in Jotunheim as the keeper of the second most sacred well of the world tree Yggdrasil. This was the Well of Wisdom, which bestowed great mental powers to those that drank from it. Mimir would drink from the well with Gjallarhorn every morning when the world was still young, and he is known as the Wise One, explaining why he refers to himself as the smartest man alive in the recent story trailer. The first chapter of the Lost Pages tells us that Odin only has one eye, and this is because of his journey to Jotunheim to drink from this well. Mimir only let him drink from it if he placed an eye in the pool. Odin let nothing stand in the way of his pursuit of more knowledge and wisdom, so he cut out his eye, and it was said that he could see farther and more clearly with one eye than with two as a result of drinking the water. His other eye remained in Mimir's well, preserved by the waters that nourished one of the roots of Yggdrasil. The fact that Kratos had to cut his head off tells us that the Aesir are still at war with the Vanir gods during the events of the game. They were the two separate pantheons of gods that existed in the Norse world, and both strive towards different ideals. The Aesir were all about fighting and feasting, but the Vanir preferred to live in harmony with nature and try to maintain its balance with magic. Images of Vanaheim leaked back in 2016, along with descriptions of Kratos interacting with the vegetation there. Vanaheim was the home of the Vanir gods, and they were known as the keepers of magic, so Kratos might be travelling to that realm to learn a new power. It's very probable that we'll stumble upon the body of Groa's husband Ervando while exploring Vanaheim. According to Norse legend, Odin sent Mimir to be an advisor to the Aesir god Heinir when the war with the Vanir was ending. When Mimir wasn't with him, Heinir couldn't make decisions, and the Vanir grew tired of this, so they cut off Mimir's head and sent it to Odin. In the God of War universe, however, it looks like Kratos beat them to it. When Odin received Mimir's head, he did not want his knowledge to be lost, and still wanted someone to turn to for guidance, so he placed Mimir's head in the Well of Wisdom under the World Tree. With Kratos being a stranger to these lands, and meeting someone that even Odin himself would consult for advice, this outcome isn't at all surprising. Parts of Midgard will be abandoned because both factions have been fighting for control of it, and it will mean that Kratos and Atreus have more time alone together in the early sections of the game. We later see them in close proximity on a canoe boat in Alfheim, the home of the Light Elves. They are designed in God of War to look like fairies, and we recently got a very close look at them. Eagle-eyed fans have also noticed that it may have been the same type of creature that we saw briefly in Midgard flying past Kratos. Alfheim was the realm of the Vanir god Freyr, who was always welcomed and acknowledged as overlord. It is described as the finest residence that was not Asgard, home of the Aesir. Freyr was the mightiest of the Vanir gods with the strength to kill a giant with his bare hands, and he was Freyr's brother. He owned a sword that was so powerful and remarkable it could fight by itself, which sounds useful in the context of having something to extend your combos. It was strong enough to beat the flaming sword of Surt, and no other sword could penetrate its defense. There was a reference to the primordial demon Surt in Groa's vision when a horrible terror is said to emerge at Ragnarok with a flaming sword. Freyr gave his sword to Skirnir in exchange for arranging his marriage with Gerd, a beautiful giantess that he spotted when sitting on Odin's throne that could see across all of the 9 realms. Skirnir was a light elf that acted as messenger and servant to Freyr. We don't have a name for this sword, but Kratos could very well stumble across it while in Alfheim, and the ESRB rating did refer to him using swords against enemies. Not long before that, we got a look at a pack of wolves who will be some of the faster attacking enemies of the game. If it isn't Odin's wolves Geri and Freki, they are most likely their descendants. After building the world with his brothers, Odin got lonely in his travels, so he created the first wolves Geri and Freki, who slowly populated Midgard with their offspring. Soon after we see the pack of wolves, we get a glimpse at a room full of treasures. The statue of the Egyptian goddess Hathor and the Greek urn featuring the Kratos of old have been much discussed, but I wanted to offer my 2 cents on the context and where I think they are. This scene reminded me of the second film in the Hobbit trilogy, The Desolation of Smaug. It should therefore come as no surprise that I think that this is the lair of the famous Norse dragon Fafnir. An armoured dragon flies past Kratos in a similar looking area above ground in the story trailer, which could very well be this character. I could also see it being Loki because of the horns, and he had the power to shapeshift into any being. You can see the world serpent in the background, which is an indication that the game may explore the consequences of a father abandoning his children because of a prophecy. J.R.R. Tolkien took direct inspiration from Norse mythology when writing both The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings series, and Smaug in particular may have been directly inspired by Fafnir. Both of them were avaricious creatures that hoarded inconceivable amounts of gold and valuable items in their lair. They were also capable of speech and loved the sound of their own voice, frequently delivering monologues. So when the ESRB rating refers to Kratos specifically stabbing the tongue of a dragon, I think it is Kratos getting sick of all the chit-chat from Fafnir. Tolkien was also directly influenced by Fafnir's origin story when he came up with the One Ring of Power that would curse whoever wore it. Odin, Loki and Heinir go hunting and kill the dwarf Ota, one of the sons of the king Hreidmar, because they mistook him for a real otter. They went to Hreidmar to show off the otter's skin, who was horrified at the sight of what they really caught. He held the gods captive until Loki could fill the otter pelt with gold, since dwarves were known to lust after gold and gems. Loki, being the god of mischief, didn't like being put in a position where someone had the upper hand on him, so he included a cursed ring among the gold to offer to Hreidmar. This was taken from Andvari, who shouted that all who possessed this ring would be destroyed. When Hreidmar acquired the gold and let the gods go, one of his sons, Fafnir, strangled him in his sleep to take possession of the treasure, including the ring. He later morphed into a dragon as a result, his monstrous shape now reflecting the inner evil within. It was the hero Sigurd, son of Sigmund, that killed Fafnir in Norse lore, and this was because the other son of Hreidmar was his foster father. Tasting dragon blood while roasting Fafnir's heart gave him the gift of wisdom in the ability to understand the language of birds. They advised him to kill his foster father because of the revelation that he was corrupted by Andvari's ring. This was obviously carried over into the story of Smeagol's transformation into Gollum after he spent too much time with the One Ring, and it does make me wonder whether it'll factor in a similar way between Kratos and Atreus if they get their hands on it. If the developers wanted to place markers on the in-game map that hint at resources or new areas off the critical path, they could find a way to make it contextual in Kratos being exposed to Fafnir's blood and being able to hear what birds are saying. This ability was a huge advantage for Odin when it came to learning about what others were up to via his ravens Hugin and Munin. Fafnir was slain with the sword Gram, which was so sharp that it could cut through shields. It could potentially be one of the weapons that the ESRB referenced when assigning the age rating. There is also the idea of throwing the axe behind an enemy with a shield and then calling it so that it hits them in their back, but I like the idea of having something that is powerful enough to cut right through them in the front. Dragas with shields are featured on Game Informer's cover art, and there will be variants of this enemy type. Some will only have a sword, others may have two, and there will be bigger ones, referred to as a heavy. The heavy Dragas are described as being difficult to stagger, with attacks that are harder to interrupt or avoid. If you look behind the scene of the Draga getting its head chopped off in this shot here, you'll notice a bigger, more intimidating variant that could be one of the heavies we encounter. The Draga themselves are vengeful warriors that died and were never sent to Hell or picked up by the Valkyrie to go to Valhalla. Episode 2 of The Lost Pages catalogues the story of a man that was killed by a bandit while protecting his clan and could not deal with leaving his wife and child behind in death. When the Valkyrie came to take him to Valhalla for dying nobly in battle, he refused and thought it was a magic trick conjured by the bandit to defeat him. He fought the Valkyrie until a white fire spread around them and turned him into a Draga, moulding armour into his flesh. In my previous video, I speculated on the creature to the far right being a sepiped from ancient Egyptian mythology. This was because it appeared to be a hybrid of a leopard and a serpent to me, but upon closer inspection, it may have no legs and scales on its skin as opposed to spots. The background of the sepiped reveals that they lived in areas outside Egypt, but this monster might be a lindworm instead, originating from Norse mythology. A lindworm is a wingless serpentine dragon with scaled skin and two clawed arms. They are normally depicted as moving like a mole lizard in the sense that they slither around like a snake, but also use their arms to propel themselves forward. On top of the lindworm we see a revenant. Revenants were practitioners of Seder magic that lost their humanity, and they have essentially been possessed by it, with their minds being warped in the process. If you look to the top sections of the Game Informer cover art, you will notice winged creatures coming for Kratos and Atreus. Examining the one on the left more closely reveals a helmet with two smaller wings on each side, which all but confirms that they are the Valkyrie. Valkyries are angel-like female warriors that decide which soldiers go to Valhalla when they die, so they can fight by Odin's side at Ragnarok. They are fearsome warriors that have the ability to regenerate their wounds, but they were also rather sinister, using malicious magic to get what they wanted. With the revelation that Atreus and Kratos are somehow involved in the events that build up to Odin's ultimate defeat, we can see why the Valkyries are there, since they fought on the Allfather's behalf. Ripping the wings off of flying creatures that were annoying in combat was always hugely satisfying, so I hope they bring back similar finishing moves for this enemy type. The same ice-infused humanoid enemies that we saw frequently in the trailer from E3 last year also appear on the cover art as they surround Kratos and some of their dead bodies pile up from under his feet. We don't really know much about them other than the fact that they are resistant to the strikes of the Leviathan axe because they are made up of the same element. This may be why Kratos resorts to using his fists and then headbutting one in a short sequence. It has been suggested that they are warriors from Valhalla, otherwise known as the Einherjar. I think this is highly unlikely overall though, because Odin was all about saving these warriors for Ragnarok, which was a much bigger overall threat than Kratos. Soldiers strive to die nobly in battle because of the thought of going to this gigantic hall where they fight all day, regenerate, and then feast and drink all night. Imagine how anticlimactic it would be if you were sent right back to Midgard to fight someone else before the ultimate war against the biggest enemies of the gods. This brings me on to the next set of enemies that actually look like human warriors. Odin created the first two humans, Ask and Embla, after the worlds were finished, and every human in the Norse universe is said to have descended from them. Dying of old age or sickness would net you a ticket to Helheim, which was not the most desirable place in the afterlife. Valhalla beside Odin was where most wanted to go, but you would only be taken to this destination by the Valkyrie if you died nobly in battle. Going after Kratos for Odin sure seems like a route that would open the doors to this famed hall. The human that we saw running away from Atreus appears to be a soldier that was looking for this source of glory before turning back and realizing that he was out of his depth. If they are deemed worthy, soldiers would fight all day in a field and then ride home to Valhalla for a feast at night. They eat the meat of a boar which is resurrected in the morning and then killed again. Valhalla itself was an enormous hall with unparalleled scale. It had 540 doors and each one allowed 800 warriors to pass through them. An ogre is also featured in the background of the cover art, who we can get a better look at in shots from last year's trailer and the God of War website. Much like the trolls of God of War, they will be akin to the Cyclops enemy class from previous games. The magical totems trolls carry have a religion around them, so naturally there are people that pray to these mysterious objects. There may be points in the game where we encounter the totems independently before they are picked up by a younger troll to be used as a weapon. And last but certainly not least, I wanted to talk about Brok and Sindri, the dwarven craftsmen that forged Kratos' primary weapon. Sindri is the dwarf with golden armour and Brok is the blue looking one. Some may notice that we never really see the brothers together, and this is because they haven't actually spoken to one another in decades. They will tie into the theme of dysfunctional families as they are in a family feud and represent the other side of the same coin to Kratos and Atreus. The story of the Jotunheim and his son also carries this theme. You could even argue that that story foreshadows what will happen between Kratos and Atreus. As we get further into the story, we will discover more of their background, but for now we know that they will constantly complain about each other and blame the other for the loss of their talent and abilities. The source of their quarrel might actually be Mjolnir since they created it. After hearing news of more Jotuns falling to Thor's hammer, Sindri couldn't help but express his guilt over feeling responsible. Brok thinks the hammer was born of Sindri's pride, but Sindri argues that it was a product of both of their efforts. They get to work on building a weapon that would successfully counter the power of the Aesir, but Brok was bitten by a spider in the process. An icy chill subsequently took over his entire body, turning his blood cold, and he passed away. Shortly after he passed, his skin turned blue. Those who are familiar with the story behind the creation of Mjolnir will probably know that this spider is none other than Loki, the Aesir god of mischief. It was the deal that Loki made with Brok and Sindri that got them to make the hammer in the first place. Because he knew that dwarves took a lot of pride in their work, he made a bet that they would not be able to forge better creations than the sons of Ivaldi, who had already made a new crown of hair for Sif, Gungnir and Skidbladnir. Gungnir was the spear that could never miss and was given to Odin, while Skidbladnir went to Freyr and was a ship that could be folded like a piece of cloth. Brock and Sindri responded with Draupnir, Gullinbursti and Mjolnir. By the time they got to making the hammer, it was looking like they were going to win the bet, so Loki turned into a fly and bit Brock 3 times while working the bellows, which is why the handle of the hammer turned out shorter than intended. Draupnir was a ring that could create a duplicate of itself on every 9th night, and Gullinbursti was the boar with golden bristles that had the ability to fly and could run faster than any horse. Now, might any of this sound familiar when thinking about the recent story trailer? The boar that Kratos and Atreus capture has a golden streak across its body that may very well be Gullinbursti. Corey did kind of hint at bringing aerial battles back to God of War on Twitter. After Brock passed away from Loki's bite, Sindri goes on a journey that isn't too dissimilar from the one that players will take in Death Stranding. He goes into a mystic lake of souls to reclaim his brother's spirit before it passes on to Helheim in the afterlife. Sindri finds his soul in the form of a bright blue wisp and brings it back. When he crawls to the shore from this bridge between life and death, he spits out a thick black liquid from his lungs. When they finished the weapon that would restore balance, it was named after the world serpent as the Leviathan Axe. It's actually very fitting considering that Jormungandr and Thor balance each other out at Ragnarok. When Thor kills him with Mjolnir, he spits out several gouts of black venom that hit Thor and cause him to die. Mjolnir's hallmark characteristic was its ability to come back to its owner, which was why I predicted a year and a half ago that Brock and Sindri would also be the creators of the Leviathan Axe. It explains why after almost being hit with the axe, Sindri gasps like he recognises it. If you look more closely at the axe, you'll also notice the logo of the Holdra brothers. I think it is Kratos' way of proving that he can be trusted, since the axe is said to have a long history with Atreus' mother and her family. The gold telescoping shield that can extend from Kratos' arm on command was also made by Brock and Sindri. Judging from it being on his arm during the funeral for Atreus' mother, I think it'll be there from the beginning, despite not being present in 2016. Going into the menu and upgrading your weapons with blood orbs have been left behind in favour of Brock and Sindri doing it for you. They will act as the game's shopkeeper in a similar way to the merchants from Resident Evil 4 and the Drebins of Metal Gear Solid 4 Guns of the Patriots. The bow that Atreus starts out with is the one his mother made for him, but we see him with a new upgrade on Game Informer's cover, for example. Atreus can be seen with different coloured arrows in his quiver as well. Red might denote the standard arrows, with yellow dealing electrical damage and green delivering poison. Looking closer at the head of the axe reveals 2 slots for runestones. These were empty in 2016's gameplay demo, suggesting that this aspect was always going to be customizable. One is associated with the light attack on R1 and the other is for the heavy attack on R2. Each one will allow for the use of a unique special move like the Ice Blast that we saw in the short demo from Paris Games Week. Some deal attacks at different ranges or even different elements like fire. The duration, cooldown and range of the attack that can be performed with a particular rune will depend on whether it is associated with the light or heavy attack. Players will also have the freedom to swap around all the ones they find to create a new suite of attacks, and each runestone has an upgrade system with multiple levels. With God of War being scheduled to release on the 20th of April 2018, we are just over 2 months away now before finally getting to play the game for ourselves. It isn't what I would consider early 2018, suggesting that there was some sort of last minute internal delay, but this doesn't matter so long as they deliver the experience that they set out to make from the inception of this reimagining. It sounds like they are 100% sure it'll hit this date, so I don't think we'll be seeing any news about delays concerning God of War. There is a part of me that's nervous, but it's not for whether the game will be good or not. I have no doubt it'll be great at the very least. It's more about whether it'll be able to meet the expectations of the fans and become the best entry in the series. Will it break new ground in the same way the original did back in 2005? I would like to thank you all for watching, especially if you watched the whole of this video. I'd be really interested in reading your feedback in the comments below, and I hope you all learned something new. If you enjoyed watching, it would mean a great deal to me if you share it with your friends and followers. You can follow me on Twitter at www.twitter.com/Cygnus_HD, as I am quite active over on the Twitterverse, and I was recently featured on the first episode of Interactive Artistry's God of War podcast. I have placed a link down in the description below for those that are interested, and I will see you all in the next video.